The Crusades is a very polarizing topic in today's political atmosphere, and is still very much fresh in people's memories and vernacular, despite occurring nearly 1,000 years ago. Depending on who you talk to, the Crusades may invoke images of brutality and intolerance, or on the opposite side of the spectrum, bravery and chivalry, but I'm not here today to talk about motives, or try to shift the blame of something that occurred 1,000 years ago on the modern people of the Middle East or Europe. Instead, we're going to be looking at the legacy these Crusaders left on the Middle East, particularly the Levant, and their connection with the modern people of these regions today. Although the people of the Levant largely identify as Arabs currently, such as the case in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, this was not always the case, with the Levant having many ancient groups that have had a tremendous impact on both Eastern and Western society. One of the first recorded civilizations in the Middle East were the Canaanites, an Afro-Asiatic people group that would later evolve into the Hebrew and Phoenician-speaking peoples, with the Hebrews later becoming the Israelites and Judeans, while the Phoenicians are notable for creating the system of writing that would later derive into the Arabic, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin scripts. The Phoenicians were essentially the Greeks of the Middle East, meaning that they were the main purveyors of civilization and culture in the region, establishing trade and settling throughout the Mediterranean, especially in North Africa, where they established the Empire of Carthage, which was one of the first real rivals of the Romans. The Phoenicians were absorbed by many empires over the years, including the Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, and later the Byzantines, and it was around this latter period that Christianity first began to spread throughout the Roman and Byzantine empires, with the Levant being one of the first major regions to adopt Christianity, converting from the former paganistic religions. The region of the Middle East was largely the hub of Christianity for a few hundred years, up until the 7th century AD, when Islamic forces from the Arabian Peninsula quickly spread throughout the region, and the Umayyad Caliphate spread Islam in the Arabic language throughout the Levant, although there were still large minorities of Jews, and in many regions such as Syria, Egypt, and the Maghreb, Christians actually made up a majority for quite some time, although gradually through assimilation and conversion, the Levantine population was Arabized and became one of the core areas of the Islamic and Arab world, although the legacy of the previous inhabitants, the Assyrians and Phoenicians, largely lived on through culture and heritage. By taking a snapshot of the world around the end of the first millennia, the Middle East is divided between the Fatimid Caliphate, an Arab empire, and the Seljuks, a Turco-Persian empire, with the traditional homeland of the Christianity being in Muslim hands, which of course didn't sit too well with the Catholic Church at the time. This led the Church to finance a series of excursions known as the Crusades, which took place in and around the so-called Holy Land in an attempt to recapture Jerusalem. And the First Crusade, which started in the year 1096, was largely a success in that aspect, with several different kingdoms being established by the Crusaders in the Levant being carved from the Seljuk Empire. But where exactly did these first Crusaders come from? Well, the Crusades carried on over a period of a couple hundred years, and alliances were very convoluted and largely ephemeral, being much more complicated than most people would think, with there being Muslim and Christian groups fighting amongst each other, all the while creating new enemies around each other in this very volatile and hostile environment. The initial Crusaders were mostly loyal to the Catholic Church and overwhelmingly came from Western Europe, which at the time was split into many kingdoms, but still mostly under the influence of the late Roman Empire, which had been defunct for over 500 years. However, its legacy still affected most of Europe through culture and language to various extents. The main contributors to the Crusades were initially the Kingdom of France and the Holy Roman Empire, an empire which spanned northern Italy, Germany, and many areas of Central Europe. However, Latin was largely the lingua franca, and thus the majority of the Crusaders spoke either Latin or French. The Byzantine Empire was in decline during this period after losing a considerable amount of territory to the Seljuks, and thus initially supported the Latin Crusaders. However, the Catholic Church considered the Eastern Orthodox practitioners to be heretics, and the Holy Roman Empire would turn on the Byzantines by the time of the Third Crusade around 100 years later. In the meantime, the Europeans, or Franks as they were referred to, had established 4 countries throughout the Middle East: the Kingdom of Jerusalem around modern Israel, the County of Tripoli in Lebanon, the Principality of Antioch in Syria, and the County of Edessa in Anatolia. At the onset of the establishment of the kingdoms, a small number of Europeans settled in the area from places like Germany, Italy, and France, and later on from other regions of Europe including Scandinavia and Great Britain. The settlers included veteran knights of the Crusades, traders, merchants, and farmers, and mostly settled in large cities such as Jerusalem, Antioch, and Tyre. Although in all regions the Catholic Franks were a minority, perhaps making up 1/4 of the population at the most, while others included Arab Muslims along with native Eastern Orthodox Christians such as Greeks, Armenians, and Assyrians. Accounts vary on the social status of the multitude of ethnic and religious groups in the kingdom, but it's generally accepted that Catholics were at the top of the hierarchy, with Orthodox Christians beneath them, with some sources claiming that Muslims and Jews had equal rights with the Eastern Christians as well. And most towns practiced a feudal medieval age form of serfdom, similar to that practiced in Western Europe, although many Eastern Orthodox or Islamic traditions were also retained in the countryside. The Crusader states lasted for around 200 years and actually managed to ally themselves with the Mongols until they were defeated by the Egyptian Mamluks in 1291, driving out the last of the Frankish kings, and most of the Europeans that had settled in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the majority of whom had lived in the region for generations, were either killed or fled, although many did remain in the countryside, having assimilated into Greek or Arab villages. Before the fall of the Middle Eastern Franks, it was common for Crusaders to marry into the native population, converting a handful of Muslim, Orthodox, or Jewish women, with the descendants mostly integrating into the Catholic population, although they would occasionally integrate into both the Muslim and Orthodox population as well. As mentioned earlier, the Christian population was gradually phased out due to lower birth rates, conversion to Islam, and a high degree of emigration for Christian groups, and they went from a majority in the Holy Land to only a small minority over the 1,000 years since the Crusade. But the influence of the European Crusaders was never fully purged from the Levant, even after centuries of Islamic rule, with the next period of European rule in the Middle East arguably being the Occupied Enemy Territory Administration, or OETA, in 1917, made up of concessions from the Ottoman Empire after World War I, which consisted of Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, with the first two falling under French control, and the last being established as the British Mandate of Palestine, which would later be divided into Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. The European mandates of the Middle East were clearly less incorporated than they were under the Ottoman Empire, and relatively few French or other European colonists had settled in the region, although a small European minority had already been present in places like Lebanon and Syria for centuries, even before European rule, mostly Italian and Greek merchants settling in the Ottoman Empire who retained their language and religion. The ethno-linguistic situation in the Levant today is certainly quite confusing, with almost all of the population outside of Israel speaking Arabic as a first language, aside from the Kurds and Assyrians, two indigenous groups in the northern half of Syria. However, these Arabic speakers may or may not identify as ethnically Arab because of the extremely rich and complex history of the region. For instance, the Druze are an Arabic-speaking ethnic group but have a separate identity, with it being heavily debated in the Islamic world whether the Druze actually practice Islam or if their practice is different enough to be considered a separate religion. Lebanon and Syria today have the highest proportion of indigenous Christians, around 40 and 10% respectively. However, these Middle Eastern Christians are by no means homogeneous, being divided between many different groups practicing both Eastern and Western Christianity, and although almost all speak Arabic as their native language, they may identify with other Arab groups or they may not. The largest would probably be the Maronites, mostly in Lebanon, who are a Catholic group descended from ancient Syriac peoples of the Levant, who were Arabized over the millennia, so are distantly related to the Assyrians. However, they only speak the Syriac language in religious ceremonies. There are also Greek Catholic communities known as Melkites who again also speak Arabic and hence are sometimes referred to as Arab Christians. However, many see themselves as the last descendants of the Byzantines in the East and may have more of a Greek identity. However, there are no remaining communities that still speak Greek as a native language, so it's up to your interpretation. One of the biggest impacts left by the old Crusaders would certainly be genetically, with the majority of the population of Lebanon having some partial European ancestry from many successive waves of immigration from Europe, either from the Romans, Byzantines, the last period of French colonization, but especially the Frankish Crusaders over 1,000 years ago, and this can without a doubt be seen in many people from around the Levant. Studies show that the average Lebanese Arabic speaker has around 12% European admixture, even when including Muslims and Druze in Lebanon, who have a much smaller degree of admixture. Although this percentage is much higher in other Christian groups, such as the Maronite Catholics, who absorbed the remnants of the Frankish Crusaders after defeat by the Mamluks. The Crusades certainly were an interesting mark on European and Middle Eastern history, with the bloodshed and tumultuous atmosphere in the region seemingly carrying on even to this day. But were it not for those Crusaders, the identity of the modern people of the Levant might have looked very different today. And again, I want to reiterate that this video is not about the morality or efficacy of the Crusades, only the legacy they left behind. Go ahead and let me know your thoughts on the Crusaders, the Mamluks, Ottomans, and the modern people of the Levant today. And if you're a Levantine Christian, please be sure to let me know whether you identify more with other Arabic speakers or with another group entirely, but be sure to keep it civil. As always, thanks for watching everyone. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.